Hello and welcome back to the third video lecture for this week, for week 8, on just preliminary ideas regarding research reports, case studies, business proposals, and so on, because these all have to do with writing. And so this is what I'd like to talk to you about in this last set of slides. And here it's talking about business proposals. The first thing is perhaps to define what a business proposal actually is. Right? It's used for solving a problem and to help organizations make decisions. So they are informative. They can also be persuasive, so that if, for example, the business proposal requires you to look at certain options to do a particular task, and you are given the task of finding 3 different ways to do it, and the business proposal is going to present the one that is the most cost effective, or perhaps the one that will be most environmentally friendly, or higher degree of sustainability, whatever it is. But there is a problem that needs to be solved, and the business proposal is going to present this information in a persuasive manner and allow the reader to see why the decision made by the decision made by the writers of the report is the following. This is what we should do. So proposals and reports, they depend on research. This has to be done properly. You're pulling information from online. You're looking at data of a whole range of different sources. And you could be conducting, tests with focus groups. You could be interviewing people. You could be conducting experiments. Whatever it is that you're doing, if it is purely informative and you purely do not need to look at anything else other than secondary information, then that will be a research report that will be probably fairly simple and fairly straightforward. But some may be much more complex and require focus groups and require interviews and further research. It really depends on what it is. So no matter what the ultimate purpose of the business proposal is, there are 5 basic steps that you need to follow through. And the first one is to define the problem. What is it that you're looking to do? What is the task that's been given to you to solve? What is the problem that you have to solve? 2, where to gather the necessary data and information. And this is where finding reliable sources is crucial, because your research is going to cost money to someone. Someone that reads this will have to make a business decision on what to do to solve this problem. So you want to be able to gather the necessary data and information that is useful, valuable, and necessary. You want to analyze that data as well, make sure that that information is going to be useful to that person who's reading it. You also want to make sure that you can organize that information properly, so the person reading it can go through and actually make sense of that information that you've correctly found, you've collated. That's what I'm trying to say. So you define the problem, gather the necessary information, analyze the necessary information, organize the necessary information, and then finally write the report. And that's essentially it. So when you're writing a business proposal, really you need to keep in mind that this report is going to matter economically, because you're asking this organization to change something, or to bring or implement about a change that is agreed upon. So that proposal will be the deciding factor on how this business moves forward in dealing with a problem. It could be a logistical problem, could be a manufacturing problem, it could be a supply and demand problem, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But there is a sense of similarity in what the proposal needs to look like and what it needs to do. So you want to get the project accepted. You want to get your recommendations, your persuasive recommendations accepted as being the right ones. But you can only do that if you define that problem carefully. And the purpose for defining the problem, it really has a lot to do with the potential audience. If the audience reading this is a general audience, you're now writing for a general audience that wishes to see how this business model that was failing in the past now is really super successful. What happened in between? What did you do? So if the business is successful, you now have a trajectory that you can look at. So you're defining the initial problem, the purpose for defining it, because otherwise the business model would have collapsed and failed. And so you want to be able to present all this information to an audience that at the very least has an interest in it. So you want to be able to think about your audience, define them to some degree. And if you do that, you will be able to present this material in such a way that it is effective, persuasive, and understood. So if you can do that, and you choose that strategy carefully, that business proposal will basically check off all the boxes, right? And will be useful to both the immediate concerns, which was the business about to fail, and now it's successful, as well as looking at it sort of from kind of through a rearview mirror, as it were. Remember a few years ago we were in this spot, and boy, we just managed to dodge a bullet, and now we're okay. Well, how did we get here? How did we do that? How do we make that change? How did we instill it? And so the business proposal kind of maps it out. So reader benefits are always important. Now, this could be, this is a warning lesson. This is sort of, an eye-opening, like, hey, just when you think you're doing well, this could have happened to you. This is how we dealt with it. So it's a warning. So there are benefits to reading these kinds of proposals. They could be immediate and short term. This was the original proposal that was given to that business to help them to turn around. And somebody can go back and revisit it 5 years later, or even earlier, a couple of years later. But the benefits need to be clearly stressed to the reader why this proposal is worth reading. Pay attention to details. Make sure that when you present it, it has both a visual impact and then also information impact, right? So that really good ideas are presented up front without too much sort of verbiage. It's clear and concise. Business reports are not English essays where you have to spend hours and hours, pontificating over a single word that Shakespeare may have used. Attention to detail, concise and precise, and gets right to the point. So you do that by proofreading and making sure the material is good. You want to keep and maintain that professional image because it is a business proposal. It's not a high school essay. And ultimately, all of this rests on having a clear view of the problem that you are trying to address and the actions that you've decided to follow through with in order to solve it. Okay, so a proposal should answer the following questions convincingly, both to the writer that initially is putting it together and to the reader that will read it later on. Okay, first one, what problem will you solve, right? You need to define that problem. And this is why it's important here in this particular case, because what problem will you solve has a lot to do with what we would say in an English class, what's your main thesis, right? And in fact, it doesn't have to be English. Any class, in any position, any time you have to write a paper, you should have a main thesis, right? What is my main point? So what problem will you solve can be translated or paraphrased into what's your main thesis. So if you can define the problem or the main thesis and the potential audience that is going to read it, that will really go a long way towards identifying what you need to do, what kind of research you need to conduct, and the language you need to present these ideas in so that that potential audience will understand it. So how will you solve it? You need to show your methods and the timelines, show that they're feasible, show that the solutions in this business proposal are economically sound, they're efficient, they're timely, they're cost effective. All these terms are, of course, from the business world, but that's what you're writing. Again, you're not writing an English essay. You're not thinking out loud about what Shakespeare wrote or Milton or whoever. You're thinking about how will I solve this problem that I have identified? And how are you going to provide this information, right? You need to specify the tangible products that you will produce, the tangible solutions that they are not only can be identified, they are cost effective. This is something that you can follow through with. So you ask yourself, can you deliver on this promise? You show that you have the knowledge, the staff, the skills. So when you are writing a business proposal, you need to be able to identify to the potential reader, which could be a boss, a CEO, or a group of people, that you've got the goods, right? You have got the skill, the staff, and the knowledge to pull this off, to write a good proposal. If you have any benefits, obviously a proposal is going to present direct and indirect benefits that the firm should consider when they finish reading it. You can always write those in the conclusion, because that's really where they best where they're expected and where they fit. When we complete the work, you need to make sure that you have a detailed schedule. In our case here, you'll start thinking about your research report. We're now in the second half of the course, so we have roughly 7 weeks left. So that time frame you need to consider. But if you're in the business world, in the business environment, you might have 3 weeks, you might have a month, you might have a year. It doesn't matter. But you need to be able to know what your time frame is so you can plan accordingly. And of course, what will it cost, right? Because all business proposals require people to be removed from their present occupation. And, how much will you charge? That will depend on the nature of the work, how complex it is, how long it will take, what kind of a business model or budget for interviewing, focus groups, renting space outside of the building, all that kind of stuff. All of that is going to matter, right? Showing the knowledge, discussing the benefits, presenting a schedule, and then providing a detailed budget for this proposal to be done. Excuse me. So all these things have to do with a business proposal in a business environment. But for now, you will be doing a class research project. So a student project or report should consider as you set it up, especially in the very first page, very first paragraph should summarize the topic and the purpose of the report, explain its benefits and overview of its contents. So basically it's a kind of overview, summary. It could be an abstract, but really here in the first paragraph, you're presenting just kind of an initial overview of the main idea in the report. But that is always separate from an abstract. Okay, so you want to present the problem, and what organizational problem, challenge, whatever it exists, what is its issue, what needs to be solved, and why. Is there a background to this problem? Has it been something chronic for the last 6 months or a year, or this is a unique situation? Let's say, for example, a year and a half ago, or more or less, that we had the pandemic. Everything changed. All of a sudden, wow, okay, how are we going to supply and demand, items that we were expecting to manufacture and ship out? We can't do this anymore. What's going on? So whatever it may be, present the problem clearly as early as possible so that the reader knows what it is that they're about to encounter. The feasibility has to do with, can this solution be done without being too costly or time consuming? How do we know that is the case? Again, put that information right up front in the first paragraph or two. The audience, you can address them, who in your organization would have the power to implement your recommendations, who will read this paper and who can do something about it, right? Both monetarily and in terms of perhaps hiring more people or streamlining the business model, whatever it is. So there is the problem, the feasibility in solving the problem, and the audience, and that is essentially the person that could bring about this change. If you can identify all these people in your business proposal, you're doing just fine. Okay, so we have a whole range of questions we can also consider. What is the audience's major concern or priority? Obviously to save money, if this is within the organizational environment, right? And so the major concern is to address this problem, this chronic or acute or short-term, long-term problem, what to do about it. What will the audience see as an advantage to the proposal? Well, the first thing is solving the problem so that it is no longer a problem. Are there objections? Is this too costly? Is it a short-term solution? What are we going to do in the long term? Again, these really have to do with the nature of the problem. Is your audience interested in the topic? Well, they should be, because if you have been given the task of providing a solution to a problem, I would think the audience would be very interested. And the research report that you will hand in to me in this communications class also expect the reader to be interested. This is me. I am interested in your idea, how you define the problem, and more importantly, how you define the solution. Are there terms or concepts or assumptions that I might need to have clarified to me as the reader? And this is, again, consider the audience interested, but not an expert. So there may be some terms or concepts or assumptions that do need to be used because that's the only way to discuss a certain issue. Well, make sure that you take the time to identify what these terms are. Explain them. Explain them briefly, but do explain them. And finally, how does the audience affect the content, the organization, and or the style of the report? Do I need to be given enough background information or a historical overview of the problem for me to understand what's going on? Is that important? Or can you kind of jump right in and get right to the crux of the matter, which is the problem being defined, and then moving towards a solution? All these things have to do with how you wish to address the problem, and of course how you wish to structure your proposal. Well, you've got topics to investigate, methods and procedures to go about doing this. There are questions and sub-questions that you're going to address and try to answer in your report. There will be topics and concepts that you will need to explain in order to clarify the kind of issues that we're going to be dealing with. In terms of methods and procedures, how will you get the answers to your questions? Do you need to interview people, read secondary sources? All those things matter in terms of how complex that business proposal is going to be. It has a lot to do with it. So what's happening here is, depending on the complexity of the problem, if it is, then the proposal or the solution will also be complex, because that's the nature of the problem. The main thesis is complex. So if that's the case, do work through a draft of your main questions and then the sub-questions that are derived from it. So all this stuff is important, because also, once all of this is done, you've presented it, you still need to show people where your sources are from. Where did you find this information? What primary or secondary information did you use to come up with your solution? The solutions may be presented in a persuasive manner, but we need to know where is this information from. So always provide references. That is crucial to any report. Okay, proper qualifications, resources. Do you have adequate access to the organization? If you're doing an in-depth study within the organization, that's when you're working full-time. If you're just a student and you're doing a research report, then clearly you don't need to go that far in depth, but you need to have access to information. So if you're in the business world, it's the organization, right, to talk to people, interview them. Or in a research report, do you have access to good information using the digital library on FOL, going and using Google Scholar to get that information? All of that is important. Now, once you have all that information and you know where you can find it, always make sure that you adhere to your work schedule, because you want to give yourself time to research, to read and analyze, interpret and evaluate all that material, begin writing, give yourself time to rewrite and summarize and paraphrase, editing that first draft or the second draft. And I'll tell you, the book that I just finished writing, I rewrote that thing a number of times. I'm very pleased with the final result, and it says what I wanted to say, but I'm glad I took the time to rewrite it so that it was shaped into something that I was really proud of, and I still am. And of course, if I were to go back and read it a year from now, I might go, I would have changed this or that. That's fine. It's just called learning. But at the time, you wish to revise and edit your draft to the best of your abilities. Now, you may have some visuals that you want to put in there. Make sure they are cited as well and used properly. And again, proofread, revise, and proofread over and over again. It's unfortunately something you've got to do. Now, a really good paper, it can be designed effectively with graphics in terms of just framing the page. A good design, a good document design, really, it's really worthwhile to take the time to set it up so that it's easy to read, right? It looks inviting, it's friendly. The visual style, there may be a logo that's the business that you belong to or have been hired to write this paper on their behalf. They may have a logo or a certain look. They may have a template. There may be a template that they prefer to use that has all this stuff built in, and you're just simply inputting data. So the opposite is a poorly designed document where you're not quite sure where you're reading this information. There's no citations. The pictures are not cited. You don't know where this is coming from. Is this originally drawn by someone? Well, who's that person? Even if it's original, you want to be able to cite properly. But if it's poorly designed, it's going to be really hard to read through it. So as you are thinking about something and you're working your way through, the design of it is kind of important, because it's not something you want to do secondarily or after the fact or tack it on. You want to be thinking of the design and the way this is going to look as you are working through it. So as you are writing and revising, think of ways to break down the whole block of text, right? You don't want giant, thick, page-long paragraphs. No, there's important information. But let's say you've broken down into smaller digestible chunks, and you might have little bullet points that you want to sort of provide to the reader. It's like, okay, this paragraph is essentially about this. And it's a brief paragraph, concise, precise, to the point, but it's just a small chunk of information. So as you are revising and writing and drafting, think of how it's going to look. Do I want to have these small chunks of information, that is put into the page in such a way that I can rely on visuals, where the visual now will summarize what I'm going to read? And it reminds me, the writer will remind the reader that this is why these graphics are here. They're important to visually represent information. And as we move along, we'll talk more and more about, how to use proper graphics. But all these things are important in that final design. So making sure to use white space to separate and emphasize points. You can actually put a little border around it if you want. You can use headings to group points, leading from one thing to the next. You can have some words in capital letters. Do that sparingly. You can use a capital letter at the beginning of each, verb or noun. But all caps, it sounds like you're shouting, right? It's not something you want to do. You want to use as few fonts as possible. One or two, especially if you want to highlight something, you can italicize something. You might want to increase the font size. But again, you want to have it so that it is readable. And of course, like all business correspondences, you always want to write single-spaced paragraphs, double-spaced between paragraphs. Always follow suit, no matter what it looks like. Ragged right margins for business communications. That is almost the standard these days now. Top left and lower right-hand quadrants of the page are important because we tend to read left to right. So if you want to put something really, important, of great importance, you've got a place to put it. The top left or the bottom right. And that's typically where our eye moves. So if you want to catch someone's attention, be strategic on where you put it. You can set up your visuals, in terms of columns, or your text in terms of visual columns that are easy to read. You can use color, some decorative devices. You don't want to go overboard. You don't want to have curlicues everywhere, but it's visually interesting. It's arresting. It's provocative. It catches people's attention. So be strategic about it, because it turns out that 65% of us are visual learners, and when you consider that things that kind of pop out on the page, that is something that is really useful. But don't put in numbers and visuals because it happens to look really nice. Always use visuals with a purpose, right? Always have that visual either visually representing, a complex interaction between something, time and space or whatever it may be. Don't just arbitrarily put images in there simply because they're there. It's not going to help you at all. Sure, visually it may be interesting, but that image, that visual, really has no bearing on the text that accompanies it or surrounds it. So if you are going to use visuals, have them be with a purpose. Otherwise, don't bother. Okay, visuals are good if you want to see an idea that is presented completely as a table. And there's a whole range of different ways to do, whether it's a pie chart or bar graphs. Those things are really important, but they have to state clearly the purpose of why I chose this type of an idea to represent visually than another one. Why did you need to set up a table? Why did you need to set up a bar graph or a pie chart? Relationships are really what you're trying to present in a visual relationship of sales, time and space, money spent over a period of time, whatever these things are. A visual representation of something is, of course, useful, but it has to represent something that is now discussed somewhere else in a little bit more detail. so that when someone looks at those graphics, the graphics make sense. They have a purpose. So when you do that, that's how you really use visuals in a provocative and useful way, because they make those points more vivid. It may also be a way for people to make sure they are aware of a particular relationship between time and money, we'll say. So you make a point vivid and valid. You emphasize material that might be skipped if someone were to read through too quickly, or might be buried in a paragraph on a certain page. That would be two good reasons to use visuals. Or to present material more compactly or with less repetition. You might be able to use a visual to summarize a passage out of a book. So you create using Excel maybe, a bar graph, pie chart, whatever it is, because you can present material more compactly and more effectively, obviously visually. And so words will call attention to the main points. So you have a brief description, but you can see those relationships played out in the visual representation that you have chosen as the most effective one. Whether it's, again, bar graph, chart, pie chart, whatever it may be. All of those things matter. So if you go ahead and you start writing and realize that some of the passages can be visually represented, that's when you start thinking about, okay, do I use a table? Do I use a chart or graph? Or maybe a pie chart, a bar graph, a line graph, a dot chart, whatever it may be. It depends on what you want to do. A table is good for identifying exact values. A chart or graph is good for showing relationships. A pie chart is comparing a part to a whole. A map or bar chart is comparing one item to another. Line graph showing items over time, frequency, distribution. Whatever it is you wish to represent visually, each one of those, they are different, will do exactly what you need to do. Line graph can show correlations, relations, frequency, distribution, any of those things. Whatever it is you need to do, that's when it becomes really useful to be able to have those tools at your disposal. So we'll talk about this in more detail, but this is the beginning introduction, summarizing and paraphrasing, using the visual representations and designs, and basically all of these things are going to be helpful as we start moving closer and closer towards beginning and starting to map out this research project that you will be working on the second half of this course. So take care, and we will see you very soon. Bye-bye.